Dear Excellencies, Ministers, Ambassadors, distinguished guests, esteemed speakers, and valued teachers and students of Turkish Maarif Foundation. Welcome to the second day of Istanbul Education Summit.
Let's remember what we discussed yesterday. At the beginning of the summit, we hosted President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan with his video message. The President emphasized the role of Turkish Maarif Foundation in eliminating the damages caused by the pandemic in education.
Also, the Deputy Minister of National Education, Professor Dr. Osman Sezgin, highlighted the importance of face-to-face education in the teacher-student relationship.
The President of Turkish Maarif Foundation, Professor Dr. Birol Akgün, addressed their education activities around the world. Particularly, following the pandemic, they maintained education without interruption.
And after this speech, we had a high-level meeting. The ministers from different countries shared their insights regarding the future of schools, the participation of girls in education, distance learning, and so on. Then we listened to our first panel with distinguished speakers about back to school. And lastly, we had a teachers panel. They shared their experience with us.
Turkish Maarif Foundation gives priority to having equal opportunities in education for all students in order to be able to develop their ideas and projects. This is a must for the sake of collective development in education. Now, we'll watch the shining stars of Maarif to see what Maarif students succeed in.
My name is Said Muaddes Sarighi. I'm going to introduce our team and our project in Technofest 2022. We got to final round as a finalist, and now about our project. Our project name is Third Eye, which is a complete kit for the blind.
Okay, today you take your award. How do you feel?
Oh, we are feeling amazing. Exceptional. We worked really hard, and it was a collective effort of our school, our teacher, and of course us, our parents. We would like to thank Allah for this victory. Yes, we are very happy.
Would you like to say something?
Yes, I want to say, talent has no boundaries. We have achieved this award in Turkey, and we are really glad and happy.
Congratulations, both of you. So, what would you say to Maarif students?
Just work hard. Success will eventually come to you, no matter what.
How are you feeling today as a teacher?
I'm feeling so blessed and happy just because of my students. They worked very hard and they got the position, alhamdulillah.
Merhaba, benim adım Huriye. Park Türk Maarif H8 KİS Kampusu 9. sınıf öğrencisiyim.
Bu sene biz çok çalıştık ve emeğimizin karşılığını aldık.
Bizim okulumuz Pakistan'daki en başarılı okul seçildi.
Tüm öğretmenlerimize ve Park Türk Maarif'e teşekkür ederiz.
Bu başarıdan ötürü biz çok mutluyuz.
Unë jam Atik Mustafa, vi nga Prizreni. Jam në klasën e 8 dhe vijoj mësimet në shkollën Maarif që 3 vite. Unë përveç mësimeve dhe obligime që kam në shkollë, merrem me not. Noti është sportimi preferuar që merrem nga mosha 6 vjeçare deri më sot. Unë mbështetje më të madhe gjej në shkollën Maarif. Ata më mbështesin që unë të përparoj në këtë fushë. Kam marrë edhe çmime dhe medalje të ndryshme. Nuk është as pak e vështirë, sepse kohën e organizoj së bashku me mësimdhënësit. Ata më përkrojnë që unë të mos shkëputem as pak nga stërvitit që janë obligative. Unë kam arritur shumë, sidomos në gorat e ndryshme kudo. Në shkollë jam shumë i lumtur. Është një atmosferë e këndshme. Aty gjej veten, kam shoqëri shumë të mirë. Jemi të lirë me njëri tjetrin. Uroj që çdo njeri të mos ndalet dhe të punoj në atë drejtim që i pëlqen më së shumti. Besoj se me punë e dashuri arrihet çdo gjë e bukur.
I'm Nevas Gushman and I'm from International Marif Schools of Bucharest and this is my story. I've always loved trying out new things, discovering more and taking risks. I've always loved lots of things like literature, music and science of course. That's discovering and that's my biggest passion. My brain is in harmony with the nature. If I was to elaborate, for example, if I go for a walk, I wander around with my eyes and I take a look at the things and I think to myself, this is art, everything is in symphony. I see symphony in everything. That's science and science is kind of art to me. Learning itself feeds my soul. I've always adored lots of knowledge and all kinds of knowledge. For the longest of time, for this reason, I've been wanting to enter a competition. I've been wanting to test myself and see the limits. And this contest that I entered was the chance for me. I entered and I gave the chance and I won. It was never my intention to win actually. I entered simply to test myself out and push the limits. I was disciplined throughout the process and passion is the key to success, I believe. I see myself as a passionate contributor to this lovely Mother Earth.
Thank you. It's amazing to see Marif students are rewarded at Technofest. And from Pakistan and Afghanistan to Kosovo and Romania, Marif students will be successful swimmers, scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs, and they'll be pioneers of the future. We'll start with our first panel, the future of COVID generation. Being a student at a time when COVID-19 transformed the daily life of communities and disrupted educational activities has been a challenging experience for the COVID generation. It's wondered how the traces of this period will manifest themselves among the pandemic youth in the future. In this session, the future of COVID-19 generation, disappearing and emerging career opportunities, socioeconomic and psychosocial situations will be discussed. Let me introduce our distinguished speakers. The Director for the Directorate of Education and Skills from OECD, Andreas Schleicher. He oversees OECD's program for international students assessment. He is the recipient of numerous honors and awards. Mr. Schleicher will be joining the panel with his video message. Please welcome Professor of Psychology from University of New York, Tirana, Enila Cenko. She is a counselor and development psychologist with a PhD in psychology from the Clark University of US, having received many awards and scholarship in psychology. Welcome, Professor Cenko. Please welcome Professor of Philosophy from 29 Mayıs University, Tahsin Görgün. Professor Görgün received his PhD in Fiqh Procedure and Philosophy at Berlin Free University. He speaks Arabic, German, English, and French. Welcome, Mr. Görgün. And please welcome Professor of Mathematics Education and Assessment and Evaluation from Indiana University, Bloomington, Enrique Galindo. He currently serves as the President-elect for the Association of Mathematics Teacher Educators in the US. Welcome, Mr. Galindo. And please welcome Carlos Alejandro Vargas Tames, Chief of Section for Teacher Development from UNESCO. He leads the section of teacher development at UNESCO's headquarters and the Secretariat of the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. Welcome, Mr. Vargas Tames. And lastly, to moderate the first session, I kindly invite Yusuf Alpaydın, the Professor of Educational Management and Administration from Marmara University. He is a faculty member at Marmara University, Department of Educational Science and Administration. Welcome, Mr. Alpaydın, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Does it work? Dear educators, dear researchers, dear education volunteers, welcome to the second panel of the Istanbul Education Summit titled The Future of the COVID Generation. Thank you for choosing to be here this early morning in the weekend. Thank you. We have experienced significant school closures around the world in 2020 and in 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In this process, many countries tried to respond to this problem by improving their distance education infrastructures and so on. They took some measures to prevent students falling behind. However, for a long time, students had massively experienced a different kind of education. This experience also led to some changes in the educational habits of students, teachers, and families. The students who experienced this new learning and life mode were called COVID generation. COVID generation is mostly characterized by social isolation, social emotional losses, and academic losses. This new learning experience has also led to the discussions about the nature and future of the education. Although today there's a return to the traditional mode of education to a large extent, the demands for reform in education among educators, among politicians, among society are still alive. In this session, esteemed scholars and experts will share their views on the post-COVID education and the new roles of education stakeholders. In the first panel yesterday, titled Back to School, panelists have focused on appropriate reorganization of the education in the process to returning to schools. In this panel, we will be more focusing on the long-term policies for COVID generation by taking lessons from COVID times. In the first round, I will direct some questions for each speaker and expect them to answer these questions in around 12 minutes. And I will give extra 5 minutes in the second round for concluding remarks. I would like to give the first speech to Andreas Schleicher. He will join us with a video message. Andreas is UNESCO's Education and Skills Director. He is a very famous speaker in educational meetings. I would like him to make an assessment of the future of education and skills after the pandemic. And so I will ask questions in this manner. I think we can project his video message. Dr. Andreas.
Pandemic is
I will ask
deeply disruptive.
first my questions.
Yeah, obviously the pandemic.
Dr. Andreas, What do you think about the pivotal question of whether to seize the opportunity to create a whole new powerful learning system or slip back into the status quo after the pandemic? And secondly, what specific skills and competencies influence students' career decisions in the post-pandemic era? And lastly, how can we seize the opportunity for reinvention and develop a new vision for the future of education? And we are listening to Andreas now.
Yeah, obviously the pandemic has deeply disrupted education, and it left those who were not prepared really badly behind. But we've also seen an incredible amount of innovation during this pandemic, not just technological innovation, but also social innovation. And you have many young people going back to their teachers these days saying, you know, during the pandemic, I discovered so many interesting learning resources. I learned to learn on my own, to discover new things, to actually set my own learning goals, to monitor my own learning process. Can't we, design our learning environments in the class differently? And you see many teachers going back to their school leaders saying, during the pandemic, I discovered it's not enough to be a good instructor. I had to become a really good coach. I had to become a good mentor, a good facilitator, a good evaluator, a good designer of innovative learning environments to reach my students in new ways. I had to get interested in who are my students? Who do they want to become? How can I accompany them on their journey? So you have teachers actually rethinking their role, and you have school principals going back to the local administration saying, well, during the pandemic, you left us badly alone, but we managed things. We reconfigured the spaces, the people, the time, the technology in new ways to build a new education system. So now leave us some of that space after the pandemic. So I think you will find a lot of momentum. But the pivotal question that you raise is the one, will we be better in establishing a more collaborative culture in education? If we just rely on teachers doing their work behind four walls of a classroom, we will not change education. If we get teachers to work together, to research new learning environments, to observe each other's classrooms, to engage in collaborative professional development, if we create a stronger profession among teachers, they are going to be the ones who will reinvent and reimagine education. If we build stronger networks of schools, schools often work in isolation. They do not know what's happening in the neighboring schools. We always look upwards in the system. We don't look outwards to the next teacher, to the next classroom, to the next school, maybe to the next education system. And so I hope that, we will see more of a culture change towards a high degree of professional autonomy, yes, but also more collaborative culture. And if we do, I'm fairly optimistic that this pandemic will actually have long-term implications that are positive. Yes, we need to realize that the kind of things that are easy to teach and maybe easy to test are precisely the kind of things that have also become easy to digitize, to automate. We know how to educate second-class robots, people who are very good to repeat what we told them. But what will make you human in a world in which things that are easy to teach have become easy to digitize? And when you ask yourself that question, what are those human skills that are complementary to the artificial intelligence that we created in our computers, to the technologies that are around us? You will find, of course, this has to do with cognitive dimensions, our capacity to imagine, to create, to build things that are of intrinsic worth. That's very, very important. We need to give young people more space to discover, to experiment. If you want young people to be creative, the room they have to do things, to experiment, is really important. And if you experiment, you need to take risks. If you take risks, you make mistakes. If our education systems are not better, do not become better to help young people learn from and with mistakes, maybe they will not become sufficiently creative. We have seen in our assessment of social emotional skills that often 15-year-olds are less creative than 10-year-olds. If I would tell you, you know, your 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than your 10-year-olds, you would say, well, there's something terribly going wrong in schooling. But we do not ask ourselves that question when it comes to creativity. We often treat that as a kind of personality trait. But we should ask ourselves, how can we do better in education? You know, children are all born with an abundance of creativity. You know, they are, if you have a 3-year-old son or daughter, they're going to question everything you tell them. They're going to experiment with anything that gets into the way. They're always willing to learn, always willing to unlearn, always willing to relearn when the context changes. And then we put them into school. We try to make them compatible with our ways of thinking. We make them reproduce the established wisdom of our times, not to question it. And that, I think, then, you know, creates that mindset where often, you know, we believe that intelligence is a source of growth, not, you know, the effort and the creativity that we put into this. So I think that capacity to imagine. Second dimension that I believe is very important as well is our capacity to navigate ambiguity, to manage tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white. You know, often it is the uncertainty that we have to navigate, particularly in the world in which we live today. You know, in the past, you could always ask older people. You know, they knew the answers to your questions because the world changed very slowly and they had that experience. Today, when you ask older questions, you never know. What they tell you is, you know, timeless wisdom or outdated bias. I think that is a real dilemma for people. In the year 2000, when we started with our PISA assessment, reading was about extracting, you know, knowledge from prefabricated texts. We had the television anchors that we trusted, the newspaper editors who analyzed the world for us and communicated to us. When you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia, and you could trust the answer, you find it to be true. Today, you look up information on Google and nobody will tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge, it's about constructing knowledge. A very different kind of skill set, that capacity to navigate ambiguity, manage complexity. You know, technology is great, it connects you with anyone. But in reality, it connects you with people who think like you, who look like you, who work like you. It actually makes it more difficult to engage with alternative ways of thinking, divergent viewpoints, different opinions. So once again, our capacity to navigate the complexity of the world, to understand and appreciate different ways of thinking, different ways of working. Even in the disciplines, you know, yes, of course, in science, it's important to know something of physics and chemistry. But more important is, can you think like a scientist? Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? History is not just about memorizing names and places, but can you think like an historian? Do you understand how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes? Can you think like an historian? Can you think like a mathematician? You know, mathematics is not about, you know, formulas and equations and calculating exponential functions. It's about understanding the concept, the idea of an exponential function. So that's on the cognitive side. But what is also important, that the world no longer rewards you just for what you know. Now, Google knows everything. The world rewards you for what you can do with what you know, that skills dimension, that capacity to apply, to extrapolate from what you know. And that includes not just cognitive skills, also social and emotional skills. Can you live with yourself? Can you live with people who are different from you? Can you live with the planet? Can you take responsibility? Can you mobilize your cognitive, social, emotional resources to take action? And perhaps, you know, I conclude with this, that may be the biggest differentiator today, that sense of agency, that students are not passive consumers of learning content, but that they can take responsibility for themselves and for others, and, you know, create a future that is theirs. You know, I actually think the Istanbul Education Forum is a great place to start that conversation. It is really about making education more of a whole of society enterprise. It is not just, you know, a public service where students are educated and where teachers, you know, teach, and where parents, you know, go as clients. But education in the future will be much more a whole of society enterprise, where we are all part of this equation. And I do believe creating that conversation. In the schools, are often very good to keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. And the more we can open school doors, the more we can bring the real world into the schools, the more we can connect the world of learning with the world of work. If you look to Turkey, you know, vocational education is often a last resort, not really a first choice for young people. And that's a pity. You know, we are often either educating people very academically, very abstract, very removed from the real world, or we educate them in very narrow, very practical ways. In the future, it's about building better connections between the real world and the world of learning. You know, what is very clear is that you cannot be what you cannot see as a child. You know, particularly if you come from a disadvantaged family background and you've never met a scientist, then why would you study hard in science? So bringing, you know, the expertise, the real world into the classroom and connecting learners with the facets of the world, I think is going to be very, very important. And I actually think the Istanbul Education Forum is a great place to have that conversation, to start that conversation. But we need to do more of this. The reality of learning needs to become a much more real experience. You know, in the past, we used to learn to do the work, but now learning is the work. It doesn't stop when we finish school. That's just the beginning. We need to learn throughout our lives, and we need to have that curiosity to expand our horizon. So as a school, if you succeed to give young people those kinds of tools, that motivation, that capacity to continue to learn, you've been really, really successful.
Okay. Thanks to Andreas for his first part of messages. He emphasized agency issues, active involvement of students and teachers for their learning. And now I want to go on with Enila Cenko, who's professor of psychology. So I want to ask her questions about the mental health of COVID generation. Dear Enila, what measures should be taken to address the psychosocial challenges experienced by the COVID generation during the pandemic? How have peer bullying and cyberbullying changed with the pandemic? How can we compensate for the lack of social emotional interaction in the post-pandemic era?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. As we all have experienced at a personal and social level, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted the very fabric of our lives in so many aspects, including psychological functioning and emotional well-being. The pandemic brought forth numerous stressors with both short and long-term consequences, which had for a great number of people a significant impact on their mental health. This mainly due, in my opinion, to the fact that these stressors triggered by the pandemic hit us at the very core of some basic human needs. For example, the pandemic brought into attention with force fear of loss of life or health consequences, uncertainty for the future, and a sense of lack of control. These are basic fears on the basis of which all other human fears operate. So we can only imagine the psychological distress that is experienced when these fears are prominent. Additionally, public health measures that were undertaken by governments in order to protect people's lives were oftentimes quite extreme. They involve lockdowns, quarantines, social isolation, and what they hit is another basic human need, the need for connectedness and social belonging. As a result, many people during the time when these measures were in place, they reported experiencing feelings of isolation, loneliness, despair, boredom, and annoyance. Forcing people to stay at home in confined spaces also disrupted family ties in many cases, contributing to a rise in aggression and anger directed towards partners, children, elderly people, leading to an increase in domestic violence and abuse, which we know very well is a risk factor for mental health, especially for the younger people. The pandemic also affected unemployment rates and poverty rates and led to a sense of increased financial insecurity for many people. Again, these are adverse experiences and risk factors for mental health. They deal with our human need to feel safe and secure, and this need was again put into question during the pandemic. The disruption of education, especially for the young generation, and not being able to attend schools, prevented children and adolescents and young adults from accessing environments where learning takes place, where cognitive and social-emotional development takes place. Therefore, they missed out on these very important experiences necessary for growth and development, thus affecting our need to grow and develop. All people of all ages, all nations were affected by the pandemic, directly or indirectly, but some groups were affected more than others. And data show that the young people, the youth, were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. The negative effects of the pandemic on youth mental health were greater than for more than the other age groups. This resulting from the factors that I already mentioned, from the stressors youth were experiencing, social isolation, disruption in education. They were exposed to increased abuse and violence in some cases. Their normal routines and structure were disrupted, and these are important elements for development. Data show, actually a recent report by the World Health Organization on mental health shows that the prevalence of psychological disorders such as depression and anxiety rose by 25 to 28% for the young generation. These data are quite concerning, and the degrees of psychological and the levels of psychological distress experienced by youth are not confined only to depression and anxiety, but they go into many other psychological disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, et cetera, et cetera. Youth were also not affected equally. Some young people were affected more than others. There were different factors that contributed to the level to which they were affected. Those young people who were more directly exposed to the consequences of the pandemic, their mental health was hit harder. For example, youth who underwent school closure without adequate support, those who lost dear ones or were afraid for loss of life in their families, those children and adolescents who experience a significant income decrease in their homes, those young people who underwent the pandemic during important transitional periods in their time, such as students who were at the time of taking national exams, such as matura exams in high school or in universities, or they were transitioning from the school to the workforce. Of course, the pandemic also exacerbated existing problems in mental health, so the youth that had existing problems were experienced even more increased difficulties during the pandemic. And of course, youth coming from socially disadvantaged groups, from minorities, or those living in families, communities, and schools with fewer resources, their mental health outcomes were more negative than others. These change in mental, or this increase in the negative effects on mental health of youth was also accompanied by other negative psychosocial events, such as an increase in suicidal ideation and suicidal thoughts. Data and reports are mixed on whether suicide rates increased during the period of pandemic, but we know for sure that negative self-harm behaviors increase, especially for females and adolescent females. We know that bullying and cyberbullying experienced a decrease during the pandemic. This is mainly due because schools were closed and children were at home. However, we are yet still to see what will happen now that we're back in schools with the levels of bullying and cyberbullying. Nevertheless, we are to be cognizant of the effects of these negative consequences. We may wishfully think that the pandemic is over and therefore the effects on the mental health are over. However, unfortunately, research and data show that the impact on mental health of the pandemic, especially for the young generation, for the future of our societies, are long-term. These consequences are long-term, and they have created what some consider to be a pandemic scarring, which is an issue that needs to be addressed quickly and efficiently. When children, adolescents, and young adults experience issues with mental health, this influences their educational outcomes. This leads to poorer grades, to less school attendance, to a lack of motivation and energy in attending school. And then this affects their employment outcomes. And then the poor educational and poor employment outcomes in turn affect mental health, such creating a cycle of perpetual problematic behaviors occurring for children and adolescents and young adults. So we cannot remain indifferent to what is happening with the mental health of our young people. As educators, as caregivers, as teachers, as psychologists, as parents, it is our responsibility to actively address and raise awareness of the fact that mental health is important. And this is actually a starting point, I think, when it comes to measures that we can undertake. Beginning with the starting point and the awareness that mental health is as important as physical health. We need to deepen our value and commitment to mental health. We need to understand and value its intrinsic power, even at a personal level. As was mentioned in yesterday's panels, it is important to realize and take care of ourselves and our own mental health so that we can then take care of others, of children, of adolescents, of young adults. So once we start with this awareness, not only at a personal level, but also at a societal and governmental level, then we can move on to stepping up investments in terms of mental health. This is not limited only to more appropriate funding and strengthening the mental health care system, which, by the way, during the pandemic did not function well. Services were disrupted and people were unable to access mental health care system on time and efficiently. So we need to take steps to this direction to provide more adequate funding in terms of mental health, to engage in more research and rely on evidence-based practice and policy in implementing what research tells us in terms of mental health. And very importantly, making mental health accessible and affordable to all. Not everyone currently can access mental health, and this is a problem that needs to be immediately addressed. Additionally, I believe that we need to look at mental health from a holistic and societal perspective, not just as a problem of the healthcare system, but rather as a societal problem. And in preventing mental health issues or bettering protection in terms of mental health, we need to reshape our environments, our physical, social, and economic environments, from a societal perspective. So for example, starting from the home, more initiatives, better initiatives, more efficient initiatives to eliminate issues and adverse risk factors that lead to poor mental health, such as domestic violence or preventing child abuse and neglect, providing more nurturing care that is necessary for child development, working towards alleviating poverty with different programs, In the school setting, which is another environment that needs to be reshaped, as we have been discussing in this summit, there needs to be further work and improvement into integrating mental health resources into the school setting. So not, as was mentioned in yesterday's panel, not only empowering teachers to take better care of themselves and then help students, but also increase the capacity of mental health professionals that are present in the school settings. So currently, not all schools, at least not in Albania, but I assume in other countries it's the case, not all schools are adequately covered by school psychologists or school counselors. And in this direction, not only we need to increase the number of professionals related to mental health care that work in the school, but also we can consider alternative ways of implementing by offering remote access, such as via self-care programs, which can be offered digitally, peer-to-peer programs where students are trained and then they help each other, teacher training and other staff training in relation to addressing mental health needs of children, and then being able to further refer them for further assistance if needed. Social-emotional development programs are also necessary in schools to be implemented efficiently. Anti-bullying and anti-discrimination policies and practice, as well as addressing any type of negative social norms in the schools, can ameliorate the situation in terms of mental health of young people. So ultimately, we need to strengthen mental health care, and adopt a holistic approach to thinking about mental health care. We can use the situation from the pandemic actually to more actively reflect on this need and to use the pandemic as an opportunity to advocate for reorganizing mental health the way our systems provide it and scaling up what we offer in terms of mental health for our young generation.
Thank you so much. Dr. Enila emphasized that pandemic prevented some basic human needs to be met. So psychological disorders prevailed in young people, and these disorders will have long-term effects to be considered by the school communities. Dear Enila, thanks a lot for your insightful speech. And now I want to move on. Dr. Enrique Galindo. As he's professor of mathematics and teacher education, I would like to ask him questions about mathematics, assessment, and teacher practices. Dear Enrique, how can teachers adjust their classroom practices to help students better prepare for the post-pandemic period? How can we compensate for learning loss in mathematics during the post-pandemic period? And lastly, which assessment strategies are more effective for teaching and learning after the pandemic? You have 12 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First, I want to thank the Marif Foundation for inviting me. I'm very excited to be part of this summit. The summit so far has been very informative, especially yesterday afternoon when we got to hear from the teachers. It was very inspiring to hear their stories, what they had experienced, and what they had to do to better support learning and their students. And I'm sure that was just a glimpse of all the stories out there of what teachers have been doing over the last 2 years. I'm going to address the questions in a different order. I'm going to start with the second question about learning loss and how to compensate for that. The first thing I would like to mention is that when we talk about the COVID generation, we shouldn't put all the students in the same place or in the same situation. As it was mentioned earlier by one of my colleagues, people experience the pandemic in different ways. I'm going to give a couple of examples. I am originally from Mexico, so I have experience working in the Americas, including Latin America. And if you look, for example, at what happened in Latin America, according to UNICEF, between March 2020 and March 2021, children lost an average of 158 days of school. That's a lot more than the global average that was 95 days. So there are big disparities in how children experience the pandemic. And so when we talk about learning loss, we cannot expect that we are going to have a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to understand how this was experienced in different places, and according to that, take actions. But it is true that all countries were affected. Just a few days ago, we got results from the National Assessment of Education and Progress in the US. This is an examination that is called as the US report card. And we see in the last assessment that the results are not encouraging. The National Assessment of Educational Progress has been documenting that in general, since it started in the 70s, the student scores were gradually increasing. There were big increases in the 90s, there were big increases in the 2000s, and then results stayed about the same for about 10 years. In these last results that we just learned about, we learned that the average fourth grade math score decreased by 5 points to its lowest level since 2005. The average eighth grade math score decreased by 8 points to its lowest since 2003. But again, to illustrate the differences, if you look at students in the 90th percentile, the top performers, they only lost 3 points. But if you look at students in the 10th percentile, their score dropped by 12 points. Now, experts say that loss of 1 point in this examination is equivalent to about a loss of 3 weeks of instruction. And so those kids who lost 12 points, we're talking about 36 weeks of instructional loss. And so we have many challenges. We have many challenges to address. The challenges include low learning levels, include high dropout rates, and also increasing gaps between vulnerable students and their peers. So what can we do in math? I'm going to mention a few things. One of the things is that we need to rethink how we tackle math, especially when we're trying to recover some gains. One approach that it's helpful is to approach math from the viewpoint of the big ideas. So focusing on big ideas can be a way to help the students catch up for some of the learning that has been lost. Another thing to consider is that when we went into using distance learning during the pandemic, teachers actually switched very quickly. So that shows that we can make changes relatively quickly when there are the conditions for that to happen. So one change that we could make is to really put more emphasis on student-centered learning. I worry sometimes that when we think about recovering and helping children catch up, one tendency may be to go back to teacher-centered learning, and that would be a big mistake. I think that focusing on student-centered learning will be very helpful because students can really develop understanding of mathematical ideas, and this could be a great opportunity to get more teachers involved in what it is student-centered learning. Another thing we can do in mathematics is to continue taking advantage of technology. Many digital tools were used during the pandemic. But the majority of them were tools that were used for communication, for getting together virtually. I think another important dimension of digital tools in mathematics is to use tools that allow students to do exploration of mathematical ideas, that allow them to take mathematical actions with technology, to take an action that is based on mathematics and receive feedback that is based also on mathematics. So getting teachers to learn more about those tools that can be used to support mathematics learning is important. It is also important to revise the curriculum. Many countries have learned that the curriculum may need to be revamped. For example, in the US, for many years, the highest level course that students in high school take has been the calculus class. And today, with many new professions and the importance of data, other classes may be equally or more important. For example, probability and statistics. There's currently efforts in the US to rethink the high school curriculum so that it can better prepare students for more of the careers that they are going to be available in the future. Another thing that can be done in mathematics is to think about options for those who got behind and didn't finish high school. Since we have now access to digital technologies, options for those who are older than 18 to be able to complete their high school are an important thing to have. And even though we use digital technologies, distance learning during the pandemic, I think we shouldn't have the feeling or the attitude that now we know how to do that. There is a lot to be learned about using digital technologies and for distance learning. And so continue training in that area, continue doing research about what are effective ways to use those technologies is important. And I think we also need to think about the structural problems. It's not just thinking about what teachers can do. Teachers are already overwhelmed with many tasks. And so unless we can change some structural problems, it would be very difficult to ask teachers to do even more. And so thinking about ways in which we can revamp the educational system. For example, in the US, most teachers spend most of the time in the classroom in front of the students with very little time for planning and preparation. So some of those structures need to be changed if we want teachers to continue learning and to better support their students. Another thing to do is to have strategies for re-engaging students. Many students left schooling during the pandemic and they haven't come back. And so thinking about successful strategies to re-engage students is important. I am aware of a few examples. For example, Argentina used a program in which they were doing home visits to try to get students to re-engage with schools. Brazil used a program in which they were using automatic text messages to nudge students and families to try to keep them in school or to try to get them to come back to school. A similar program was also used in LA, in Los Angeles. Another program used tutoring using text messages as a way to keep students engaged. So I'm now going to go back to the question about teachers, the first question. And when we think about what teachers in the classroom could do, I think we need to be very careful about one danger, and the danger is that sometimes when we think about learning loss, we tend to focus on content areas. And when we focus on content areas, we tend to focus on subjects that we think are the most important, and that usually math and reading. And I think even though we want to support students to recover in those areas, we really need to have a broader view. And we want to help teachers focus on the student as a whole individual and try to develop more skills other than the cognitive skills. And so it is important to help teachers see the whole learner and care for the whole individual. Personalized support is important because, as I said before, not all students are in the same place. So doing more to offer personalized support, it's important. Teachers, I think, should try to continue using the tools that they use during the pandemic and combine them with personalized instruction and try to learn to do more with them. Many families were engaged during the pandemic because students were at home. And so I think it would be important to continue that practice. If we were able to engage families, keep that engagement going, because that would be a way to support students. I'm going to now switch to the question about assessment. When we think about assessment and when we think about learning loss, one thing that may come to mind is, okay, let's try to measure the learning loss that took place and then start designing even more standardized exams to try to get a sense of where things are. And I know it is important to know where things are, but my recommendation would be that rather than designing new assessments and subjecting students to new tests, that it would be more important to gather the information we can gather from existing ongoing assessments rather than creating new ones. And if we're going to create new assessments, rather than focusing on trying to measure learning loss, I think it would be important to develop formative assessments. Formative assessments that can help the teacher know where the students are and how they can better support them so that they can plan their instruction. There are many options for assessments that will be more helpful. For example, getting the students to get feedback from their peers, using what is called critical friends. Your peers become critical friends for your work. They also give you feedback, and they also get you help you get better. Another idea is to get students to be taking ownership of their own learning. I talked about student-centered learning, and that is important, but it is also important to work with students on realizing that the learning is actually in their hands, and that in addition to schools, there are many options today to continue learning. And so trying to get students to take ownership and be responsible for their own learning is important. I think the pandemic is actually an example of resilience. We now can look back and we feel most of it is behind. But I think that is just an example of resilience in helping students realize that actually being back at school is a great accomplishment, that they succeeded because they are back at school, and recognizing that we can talk about learning loss, but there was also lots of learning that took place. And that learning that took place during the pandemic is more about recognizing being a human being, recognizing the value of working together to create a better world. And so one of my favorite quotes about resilience is from Nelson Mandela. He says, "Do not judge me by my success. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrique. He emphasized that students experienced pandemic in different ways and the amount of losses are different. Proper actions can be taken by assessing content and amount of losses. He emphasized also the importance of using digital tools, providing personalized teaching, and making formative assessments. Thank you very much again. Now I want to turn to Carlos Vargas Tames. He's from UNESCO. Dr. Carlos Vargas Tames is educational sociologist and chief of UNESCO section for teacher development. So I would like to ask him both about teacher development policies and well-being of COVID generation. Dear Carlos, what are UNESCO's learning and teacher development policies for the next generation? Secondly, which actions need to be implemented to elevate the psychosocial problems of the COVID generation? And what unique skill sets will teachers need in the post-pandemic era?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yusuf. And all of that in 12 minutes.
Yes, you have 12 minutes.
Very good. Good morning to everybody, and thank you, Yusuf, for the questions. Thank you very much for the invitation of the Türkiye Marif Foundation to this interesting summit. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to join you. I'm going to try to start from the end and going up on the questions that were asked around UNESCO's work on the field of teachers. But I wanted to share a couple of reflections on two particular issues. One of them is something that we've been discussing these last couple of days, which has to do what are some of the lessons that we learned from the COVID, or we have learned, because it's not over yet, from the COVID pandemic. And then what are some of the implications of those lessons for how we think of education differently, how we transform education. And that I will do based on a number of publications that we have issued at UNESCO and by other organizations as well, and also from lessons that we learned in the process of the Transforming Education Summit, which is a summit that took place in September at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, at the sites of the UN General Assembly, and that brought world leaders, heads of state and government, to make commitments to transform education. And of course, coming out of a pandemic, the issue of COVID was definitely there in the commitments that were made, in the reflections that were made, and that is something that I would like to share with you. And what are some of the implications for that, for the work of teachers? So I will not focus on the learning losses. I will not focus, certainly not necessarily directly, on the psychosocial well-being. I will not focus, and I will actually challenge this idea of learning recovery, because we certainly don't want to go back to normal, because normal was not good enough. And we don't want to go back to educational exclusion. We don't want to go back to discrimination in education and the reproduction of inequalities through it, which is something that we've been seeing that education systems can actually do very well. But we don't want to go back to that. So I will challenge the idea of the recovery, and I will challenge the idea of the learning losses. I concur with Enrique. There's a lot that was learned during the pandemic, and I would like to focus at policy level, at global level, what these lessons were. So the first lesson, I would say, has to do with the fact that education can change. It sounds easy, it sounds simple, but it's not always witnessable. You don't always witness education changing. And because education systems can be very heavy, can be very traditional, can be very inflexible, but during the pandemic, we realized that education can actually change. And it doesn't necessarily take sometimes a master plan. It changes on an everyday basis, and by the contribution of a number of factors. Secondly, we learned that teachers have the capacity to enable that change, that teachers can actually adapt educational provision to changing demands and in the most challenging contexts. So we've seen, and I will not reiterate, but we've seen many examples of them were spoken of yesterday as well, and when teachers actually adapted the curriculum, adapted the content, adapted the organization of learning, adopted diversified methods, and so on. So this is also a realization that the transformation of education is within the hands of teachers as well. And I think that is important. When we talk about learning losses, when we talk about the preoccupation for learning the foundational, we realized through the pandemic as well that what is foundational, what is vital, changes in context and changes in time. What was vital during the pandemic was to learn about how to take care of oneself. It was how to be free from contagion, from infection, how to keep others safe. And that was actually vital content, more than mathematics at that time, more than reading and writing, literacy, what they call foundational learning. It was around staying alive, like the song, and also about being safe with others. So also the idea of what is foundational and what is the basic learning that we need changes according to context and to circumstances. And the actors that are the closest to this context and to these circumstances are teachers. They are the ones that have first-hand knowledge of what are the problematics within the communities, within the learners, and who can actually adapt education accordingly. But in order to do this, teachers need to be supported, they need to be recognized, they need to be trained, and they need to be acknowledged as policymakers as well. So not teachers only as those who actually implement the curriculum, but teachers who are actually decision makers at the classroom level, as we have seen, by deciding what is the most important content, when is the best time, what are the different formats. As we said during the pandemic, the calendars were thrown out of the window, the learning spaces changed, the content, the methodologies, and so on. So then the role of teachers is very important. And that is one of the lessons that we learned from the Transforming Education Summit. First of all, that there is no transformation of education without teachers. So that is just bottom line. However, we do see worldwide that there is a shortage of teachers. There are just not enough teachers in the world. If we want to achieve universal primary, secondary education, 1 year of pre-primary teaching, we do not have enough teachers. According to our institute, the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, we need some 70 million teachers to be recruited from here to 2030 if we want to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 4. So that means a huge number of teachers that are required. Not only that, there's also the issue of teachers actually leaving the profession. Teachers leave the profession because they don't find it very attractive. There's an issue, of course, of working conditions that have to do with the contractual conditions, with the remuneration, but it also has to do with how we think of teachers and how much trust we confer them. So it is important to say that also to stay in a profession, because sometimes when one thinks of why teachers leave the profession, we usually think of they don't make enough money, which is very true in many contexts. Their salary is not comparable to that of other professionals. That's true. Their contractual conditions, they can be unstable, they can be temporary, they could be unattractive. That is true as well. But even in those countries that pay and hire teachers properly, where they receive a good salary, they leave the profession too. And that is within the first 5 years. So then when we think of working conditions, we need to think beyond the contractual and the remuneration, and it has to do with how well we treat teachers. And it has to do with how we trust their pedagogical judgment, how we trust the knowledge that they have actually produced in the classroom, and how we use that knowledge. Instead, because of our wish to assure the quality of education, we have put in place a number of accountability mechanisms that curtail, that undermine the work that teachers do. So it is not very attractive to be a teacher if you are being told what to teach, when to teach, how to teach. You're being inspected so that you teach that, and then you're tested for that. It doesn't leave much room for autonomy, for agency, for creativity, for all of these things that we've been thinking and saying about the teaching profession. So now when we think about transforming education, we have to transform the way we think of teachers, and we have to transform the metrics as well of what we expect of and for teachers. There's an issue, of course, of gender representation within the profession, which is based on biases around whose responsibility is the care, the upbringing, and the education of children. So we see, of course, gender disparities from early childhood education, where we have most of the teachers globally are women, all the way to this trend reversing when we go to higher levels of education, especially certain areas like science, mathematics, and others. And of course, we see glass ceilings as well. So even though the vast majority of the teacher force is female, the leadership is not. So that is something that needs to be remedied as well, if we want education to be inclusive and to be a human right. Now, when it comes to the working conditions, of course, I will not delve more into it because I know I have very little time, but there's the remuneration, the contractual, the actual, how we make teaching an intellectually rewarding profession, one which one is inspired to do, and therefore can actually inspire others. Another issue has to do with the opportunities that teachers have for professional development. We have in many countries an issue of qualifications. There are many teachers who are in classrooms who do not have the proper qualifications to be teachers. And that has to do with the pedagogical training and so on. But there's also a way of how we actually qualify teachers? What kind of teacher development? And yesterday we were hearing some comments around how this changes from an individual, from not only an individual, but a course-based, specific form of training and development to something that is lifelong, that is life-wide opportunity for exchange. Teachers learning from one another, definitely has been mentioned before, peer learning, communities of exchange, communities of practice, communities of learning, where again, the knowledge that teachers produce is actually examined, is actually synthesized, is actually shared, not only for the betterment of teaching in a certain setting, for the use of this knowledge of other teachers, and most importantly, I would say, to feedback into education policy. Again, we rely countless of times with assessments around the learning loss, around assessments, around the realities, and we seldom listen to the voice of teachers about those realities. So I think it is important to consider that. And then finally to say, if we want teachers to make a difference, if we want teachers to innovate in practice, which we do, we need to grant them the autonomy and the agency that is needed to do that. So on the one hand is the professional development that allows teachers to adapt their practice, to cater for the different needs of their students, to instill in them a sense of belonging, a sense of responsibility for themselves, for the world, for others, for the planet. Then we need to think of professional development in a different way, but we need to give teachers more autonomy so that they can actually innovate. And this issue of more autonomy has to do with teachers being able to participate in educational decision-making. As we said, not only in the classroom, but when it comes to policy. And that, sadly, is something that does not happen often. Teachers are not used to taking part in the decision-making tables. That requires certainly some professional development in terms of collective bargaining, in terms of association of teachers, in terms of the work of unions, of collectivities that can actually work together to bring policy solutions to the table, grounded on the knowledge that teachers actually have. So with that perspective of the learning that we have had from the pandemic, and from some of the conversations that we've seen and the commitments that we've heard in the Transforming Education Summit, I arrived to your question as to what is UNESCO's response to this state of affairs. So first of all, what we're trying to do is to transform education, looking at how education can actually shape better, more just, more sustainable futures for all. Last year, and I invite you to visit our website, you will be able to find the report that the International Commission on the Futures of Education, which was convened by UNESCO last year, and worked for about 2.5 years consulting a large number of intellectuals, teachers, policymakers, social activists, and so on, shaped the idea of what the future of education looks like. So I will not tell you much so that you can actually read the book. But the 5th chapter speaks about what are the implications of that vision for education for teachers. And that is what shapes UNESCO's agenda on teachers' work. So first of all, the publication calls for a new social contract for education in which teachers are central, in which we rethink, we reimagine education, and we recast teaching as a collaborative profession. That's one of the principles, let's say, of this publication and the principles of UNESCO's work in education. Now, thinking of teaching as a collaborative profession has certain implications for policy, so how we do policy, together, collectively, with the voice of teachers. It has implications for teacher professional development, so how we think of teacher learning collectively by means of peer learning and exchange, by means of collaboration, by means of social dialogue and participation, how we think actually of the pedagogies and the work that we do that foster that sense of community. So methodologies such as action research, service learning, community outreach, and many others that are collective in nature, and in which teachers, in which students can actually, and teachers as well, deploy and learn, deploy their knowledge and learn from one another. And it helps also in regaining trust in teachers. So just to wrap up, because I know I've taken a little long time, to say, if we think what are the skills that teachers need in the post-pandemic era, I would say they are the same skills that teachers are actually trained to develop and to deploy. Again, it has to do with adapting education to the needs, to the wants, to the aspirations of their learners, inspiring them curiosity, creativity, and lifelong learning, so learning to learn, and the desire to continue learning, and instilling in them a sense of belonging to a global community, a sense for responsibility for that community, for one another, and for the planet. So with that, I will wait for the second question to elaborate upon other things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your impressive speech. He reminded us that for educational change, teachers should be central, and they should be recognized, acknowledged, accepted as leaders and policymakers of education. Thank you very much again. Now, I would like to give the last speech to Professor Tahsin Görgün. He is professor of philosophy, and he has many works on educational philosophy as well. I would like him to make a more universal and paradigmatic evaluation to make sense of our current educational experiences. He prefers talking in Turkish, and I will address him in Turkish with your permission. I switch to Turkish now. Please take your microphones. Tahsin Hocam. Mikrofon.
Evet,
çalıyor.
efendim.
Tüm disiplinlerin felsefeden çıktığı bilindiğine göre günümüzde felsefenin eğitimdeki rolünü nasıl değerlendiriyorsunuz? Birkaç sorumuz var size de. Günümüzdeki okul sisteminin üzerine kurulduğu felsefe ve paradigmalara pandeminin nasıl bir etkisi olmuştur? Dijital kültürün yaygınlaşmasını pandeminin etkileriyle birlikte düşündüğümüzde öğrenci, öğretmen ve aileye yansımalarını nasıl değerlendirirsiniz? Sorularımız bunlar hocam. Yani hocalarımız, sizden önceki konuşmacılarımız öğrenci düzeyinde, öğretmen düzeyinde, politika düzeyinde değerlendirmeler yaptılar. Sizden de belki bu yaşadığımız süreci, Covid ve sonrasındaki süreci, belki dünya tarihi içerisinde, eğitim tarihi içerisinde veya düşünce tarihi içerisinde nasıl konumlandırıyorsunuz? Böyle bir değerlendirme yapabilirseniz memnun oluruz.
Evet, teşekkür ederim Sayın Başkan. Muhterem hazırın, sizleri hürmetle selamlıyorum. Böyle bir zirvede, eğitim zirvesinde bulunmaktan dolayı hissettiğim memnuniyeti de paylaşmak istiyorum. Tabii ben meseleye biraz daha tabiri caizse tümel cihetten, felsefi cihetten bakmak istiyorum. Dolayısıyla eğitimin pandemi süreciyle birlikte bu pandeminin bize öğrettiği birçok husus var. Onları dikkat alarak pandemi sonrası eğitimle alakalı hem ne gibi imkanlar ortaya çıktı, hem ne gibi sorunlar ortaya çıktı. Bu imkanları ve sorunları birlikte dikkate aldığımızda acaba eğitimle alakalı olarak neler yapılabilir? Bununla alakalı genel bir perspektif sunmaya çalışacağım. Şunu ifade etmek isterim. Benden önceki konuşmacılar ve dün de dünkü yapılan bazı konuşmaları da takip ettim. Orada da dikkatimi çeken bir şey oldu. Genellikle ortak kaygılarımız var, ortak tespitlerimiz var, benzer çözüm önerileri var. Yani bu raya iştirak edenler önceden bir araya gelip bu fikirler üzerinde anlaşmadıklarına göre bu aslında bizim kendi varlık şartlarımızla ilgili insanlık olarak ortak bir bilinç, ortak bir tecrübe yaşadığımız ve insanlık olarak karşı karşıya kaldığımız veya sahip olduğumuz imkanlar ve meydan okumaları olduğunu ve bunu insanlık olarak algılayıp o şekilde bunlara yönelebildiğimizin bana alametleri olarak gözüktü. Bu benim için ayrıca memnun ediciydi. Ben bir metin hazırladım ve bu metni daha önceden paylaşmıştım. Özellikle mütercimlerimizin işini kolaylaştırmak için. Müsaade ederseniz bu metni takip ederek sunumumu devam ettireyim. Pandemi bir taraftan sorunlar ortaya çıkarırken aynı zamanda bazı imkanları da açığa çıkardı. Hatta şunu söyleyebiliriz, pandemi bizi dijital yani sanal imkanların epeyce tayin edici bir konum kazandığı varlık şartlarımız ile yüzleştirdi. Bu daha farklı bir şekilde ifade edecek olursak, zaten orada olan ama farklı sebeplerle yeterince algılanmayan ve dikkate alınmayan, varlıkta ve varoluş şekillerinde belirli bir cihetten bir değişim anlamına gelen dijital boyutun varlığını tartışmasız bir şekilde gösterdi. Yani şöyle söyleyebiliriz, daha önce biz belki yazının dünyasında yaşıyorduk, şimdi aynı zamanda yazılımın dünyasında yaşadığımızı fark ettik. Dolayısıyla yani bunu geriye doğru götürebiliriz. Çok fazla gerilere gitmeye gerek yok. Yani biz yazının, kitapların dünyasında yaşarken eğitim alanında özellikle şimdi artık yazılımın dünyasında yaşıyoruz. Ve bu yazılımın dünyasında yaşadığımızı pandemi bize tartışmasız bir şekilde gösterdi ve bunun geri dönüşü yok. Öyle gözüküyor. Pandeminin bir hadise olarak kendisini temsil etmekten daha çok bizim halimize tercüman olması, hayatımızın ekonomi, siyaset, sanat, gündelik hayat, ahlak, gündelik hayat ve sanat gibi muhtelif alanlarında birçok şeyi yeniden düşünmeyi kaçınılmaz bir hale getirmektedir. Eğitimde bu alanlardan birisi, belki birincisidir. Pandemi sürecinde öğrencilerin ve öğretmenler yanında okulun işleyişinde vazife alan okul görevlileri bina olarak okuldan uzak kaldılar. Pandemi sonrasında herkesin yeniden fiziki mekan olarak okula dönmeleriyle gerçekleşen normalleşmeyle birlikte pandemi yavaş yavaş unutulacak olağanüstü bir hal olarak kayıtlara geçerek zamanla unutulacak sıra dışı bir olay, bir tür kaza olarak görülebilirdi. Ama biz bunu yaşadığımız ve farkına vardığımız hususlardan dolayı öyle göremiyoruz. Çünkü pandemi eğer kullandığımız dijital imkanlar olmasaydı, muhtemelen hayatın birçok alanda olduğundan daha çok eğitimi aksatacak ve yaşadığımız 2 yıl boyunca muhtemelen eğitim askıya alınacaktı. Ancak öyle olmadı. Eğitim dijital imkanlar kullanılarak sürdürüldü, büyük ölçüde tabii ki. Dijital imkanların kullanılarak yürütüldüğü eğitimin kalitesiyle ilgili birçok soru var ve bu soruların haklı gerekçeleri de bulunmaktadır. Ki benden önce burada konuşan ve dün de bu konularda katkıda bulunan panelistler bu sorunlara epeyce işaret ettiler. Ben bu sorunlarla meşgul olmayacağım tabii. Benim burada üzerinde durmak istediğim husus, pandemiyle ilgili olarak eğitimin kalitesi cihetinden ortaya çıkan, hiç de önemsiz olmayan sorunlardan daha çok, bana daha esaslı gözüken bir hususu işaret etmek olacaktır. Dijital imkanların genel olarak hayatımız ve özel olarak da eğitim süreci içindeki konumu ve bunun ortaya çıkardığı bazı imkanlar ve sorunlar. Pandemi olarak sıra dışı bir hadise olmakla birlikte, yaşadığımız şartlarda hayatımızda gerçekleşen ama eğitim sisteminin ve özellikle yetişkinlerin çok da farkında olmadıkları bir imkan. Dijital araçlar ve yapay ortamlar sayesinde eğitim genel olarak aksamadan sürdürülebildi. Yani 3 yıl öncesine kadar yetişkinlerin büyük bir kısmı bu yazılımların dünyasıyla özellikle bu teenager yani 10 yaşlarında hatta daha küçük yaşlarda olan yeni yetişen nesillerle mukayese edildiğinde neredeyse irtibatsız gibi çok sınırlı irtibatları vardı. Ama pandemi ortamında özellikle eğitimle iştigal edenler birden kendilerini bu dijital imkanların ortasında buldular ve onunla karşılaştılar. Bu ortama yani bu imkana yazılımların oluşturduğu dünya adını verebiliriz. Yani şunu söyleyebiliriz, eğitim yazılımların oluşturduğu ortamlarda devam etti. Yazılımların oluşturduğu ortamın en önemli tarafı eğitim açısından öğretmen ile öğrencinin fiziki anlamda aynı ortamı paylaşmaması, yine de aynı ortamda bulunmasıydı. Aynı fiziki ortamda bulunmamanın ortaya çıkardığı sorunlar kendi başına konu başlığı olmakla birlikte dediğim gibi biz burada bunun üzerinde durmayacağız. Bizi burada ilgilendiren taraf fiziki olarak öğretmenle aynı ortamda bulunmayan öğrencinin artık karşısında canlı kanlı bir insan yerine duruma göre bir ses, duruma göre bir görüntü bulması ve ilişkisini bu ses ve görüntüyle kurmasıdır, yürütmesidir. Burada artık öğretmen ile öğrenci arasındaki ilişkinin mahiyetinde bir değişimin ortaya çıktığını söyleyebiliriz. Öğretmenin aynı fiziki mekanda bulunmaktan kaynaklanan otoritesi en azından klasik sınıf düzeyiyle mukayese edildiğinde önemli bir kayıp yaşadı. Benzer bir durum öğretmen için de geçerlidir. Onun için de öğrenci olduğundan daha farklı bir formda zuhur etti. Biz bu durumu yetişkinler olarak yaşadık ve böylelikle hayatımıza şu veya bu oranda yeni bir boyut eklendi. İşin ilginç olan tarafı tam da bu noktada karşımıza çıkmaktadır. Şu anda okula giden neslin büyük bir kısmı pandemi öncesinde zaten bu yazılımların oluşturduğu dünyada yaşıyordu ve bu dünya onlar için yetişkinlerden farklı olarak yeni değildi. Dolayısıyla öğrencilerin pandemi şartlarındaki eğitime genel olarak öğretmenlerden daha kolay uyum sağladıklarını söyleyebiliriz. Okulda öğrencilerin, ailede çocukların hayatının önemli bir kısmının bir boyutunun yazılımların oluşturduğu dünyada geçtiği bir hakikat olmakla birlikte genel olarak ne okul ne de aile bunun ya farkında değildi veya yeterince dikkate almıyordu. Pandemi süreci geri dönüşü olacağı benzemeyen bu sürecin hayatımızdaki yerini göstererek bizi bir hakikatle karşı karşıya getirdi. Şu anda okula giden neslin fiziki dünya yanında yazılımların oluşturduğu yani şu anda okula giden nesil fiziki dünya yanında yazılımların oluşturduğu bir dünyada da yaşamaktadır ve gelecekte de fiziki dünya kadar sanal dünyada da yaşamaya devam edecektir. Eğitim sistemi bu hakikati dikkat alarak kendisine çeki düzen vermek zorundadır. Eğitim açısından bakıldığında öğrencilerin hayata hazırlanması cihetinden öğrencilerin aynı zamanda yazılımların oluşturduğu dünyada yaşamaya hazırlanması kaçınılmazdır. Daha farklı bir ifadeyle öğrenciler hem şu anda yaşayan insanlar olarak hem de gelecekte yaşayacak yetişkinler olarak sadece fiziki dünyanın imkan ve sorunlarıyla meşgul olmayacaklar. Bunun ötesinde yazılımların oluşturduğu dünyanın imkan ve sorunları ile de meşgul olacaklardır. Eğitim, öğrencileri kendi zamanlarında yaşamaya hazırlamak zorundadır. Pandeminin öğrettiği en önemli şey, eğitimin sadece bilgi ve beceri aktarma faaliyeti olmadığı, yetişmekte olan insanların bunun ötesinde ihtiyaçları olduğunun fark edilmesi olarak belirtilebilir. Ama bu aynı zamanda insanların, özellikle yeni yetişen neslin varlık şartları konusunda yetişkinlerin bir bilgi elde etmesine vesile oldu. Yeni yetişen nesillerin dünyası, fiziki nesneler ve gerçek insanlar yanında yapay zeka ve yapay ortamlar olduğu ve bu ortamların da artık çevre olarak dikkate alınması gerektiğini gösterdi. Bu çevre en yaygın ifadesiyle medya ve sosyal medya yeni yetişen nesillere çevre oluştururken bu aynı zamanda onların tabii olan ile ilişkilerini, tabii olanın içeriğini bir cihetten genişleterek ama aynı zamanda başka bir cihetten de daraltarak etkiledi. Bu etkilemeyi değiştirme olarak da isimlendirebiliriz. Pandemiden sonra şunu daha iyi biliyoruz. İnternetin, Twitter'ın, Instagram'ın özellikle TikTok'un ve benzeri ortamların oluşturduğu çevre, yeni yetişen nesiller için anne babaları, kardeşleri, mahalledeki tanıdıkları ve arkadaşları kadar ve belki duruma göre onlardan daha yakın ilişki içerisinde bulunduğu bir çevre. Yani bunu çok görürsünüz. Öğrenciler bir araya gelmişler, ellerindeki cep telefonlarıyla, herkes kendi cep telefonuyla meşgul oluyor. Yan yana oldukları halde yanındaki fiziki manada mevcut olan arkadaşlarının farkında bile değiller. Bu durum eğitim ile iştigal edenlerin önüne yepyeni meydan okumalar çıkarmaktadır. Bu meydan okumalar sistematik bir şekilde araştırılmadan 10 veya 15 sene, yani o kadar bile öncesine kadar büyük ölçüde geçerli olan yaklaşımlarla yetinmek, yeni yetişen nesiller ile irtibatın koparılması gibi bir sonucu ortaya çıkarabilir. Her şeyden önce dijital imkanların kullanılması, sınıf ve okulu sadece fiziki bir mekan olarak görmenin artık yeterli olmadığını gösterdi. Pandeminin öğrettiği şeylerden birisi bu. Eğitim kısmen artık dijital imkanlar kullanılarak ve sanal ortamların sağladığı imkanlardan da istifade edilerek sürdürülecektir. Meydan okumaların en önemli özelliği tam da pandemideki virüs gibi dinamik bir karakteri olmasıdır. Yeni yetişen nesillerin dünyası artık sabitesi olmayan, sürekli değişen, duruma göre bir cihetten sınırsız ama başka bir cihetten küresel tüketim mekanizmaları tarafından yönlendirilen, bu haliyle oldukça dinamik süreçlerden oluşuyor. Bu süreçlerin özelliği belirli amaçlar etrafında olup yok olarak ilgileri üreterek yönetmesi şeklinde tayin ediyor. Dolayısıyla eğitim ile iştigal edenlerin bu meydan okumalarla karşılaşarak, tercümeyle alakalı bir sorun mu var? Evet, peki. Dolayısıyla eğitim ile iştigal edenlerin bu meydan okumalarla karşılaşarak bunlarla baş edebilmeleri, dinamik süreçleri kontrol edemeyecekleri için öğrencileri bu dinamik süreçleri yönetmeyi başaracak yetkinliğe kavuşturmaya çalışmak olacaktır. O zaman eğitimin merkezine, yani İngilizce çok yaygın olarak kullanıldığı için onu söyleyeyim, know that yerine know how'ın yerleşmesi kaçınılmazdır. Ama bu know how, dediğim gibi, kendi başına daha derinlikli bir şekilde üzerinde durulması gereken bir husus. Dolayısıyla bu husus üzerinde biraz daha durmamız gerekmektedir. Her şeyden önce Yazılımların oluşturduğu sanal dünya neredeyse fiziki, tabii dünya kadar büyüktür ve bu dünya yeni yetişen nesillerin karşısına sınırsız veriler olarak çıkmaktadır. Verilerin çokluğu sanal dünyanın en önemli özelliğidir. Biraz temkinli bir ifadeyle 30 yıl öncesine göre bugün malumata, ki bu malumat dediğimiz şey knowledge değil artık, information, yani malumata ulaşmak artık bir sorun değil. Mevcut dünya hakkında verilere ulaşmak, malumat toplamak sorun teşkil etmiyor. Arama motorları üzerinden çok kısa bir sürede sorulan her soruya sayılamayacak ve hatta soran tarafından ihate edilemeyecek kadar çok cevap bulunabilir. Sanal ortamlarda sorun, malumatın çokluğundan öte aşırılığıdır. Aşırı malumat var. Bu çerçevede ortaya çıkan sorunları çözmede iki cihet karşımıza çıkıyor. Birincisi, malumatı yapısal olarak tanzim edecek üst mekanizmalar oluşturmak. Bu, devletlerin ve devlet benzeri yapıların önündeki en önemli sorun olarak durmaktadır. Bugün arama motorlarının ve sosyal medyanın nasıl işlediğini dikkate alarak, kimin hangi malumata hangi formda ulaşacağının veya hangi malumatın kime nasıl ulaştırılacağının sistematik, yani algoritmik olarak belirlendiğini dikkate alacak olursak, bu alanların yapısal olarak kontrolünün hem mümkün hem de gerekli olduğunu söyleyebiliriz. Sürece sadece yasal olarak refakat etmenin yeterli olmadığını, süreci iştirak ederek birlikte şekillendirmenin kaçınılmaz bir zorunluluk olduğunu bugün daha iyi biliyoruz. Bu kısım eğitimden daha çok eğitimin de içinde gerçekleştiği ekosistem ile doğrudan alakalı olduğu açıktır. Eğitimle alakalı olan kısım ancak bu alanla alakalı gerekli tedbirler alındıktan sonra anlamlı olacaktır. Hani bizim Türkçe'de kullandığımız bir tabir var. Taşları bağlayıp köpekleri saldığınız ortamlarda yani insanlar çaresiz kalır. Eğitimciler de orada yapabilecekleri şeyler fazla değil tabii ki. Dolayısıyla yani taşları hem serbest bırakmak, diğer taraftan da insanların ellerini bağlamamak gerekiyor. Öyle söyleyeyim. İkincisi, yani ikinci cihet, bu cihetten eğitim sistemini bu süreci dikkat alarak yeniden tanzim etmek şeklinde ifade edebiliriz. Buna göre eğitimin yeni yetişen nesiller kadar yetişkinleri de içinde yaşadıkları şartlarda karşı karşıya kaldıkları sorunlarla başa çıkacak bir şekilde planlanması ve icra edilmesi gerekmektedir. Her şeyden önce dikkate alınması gereken hareket noktası, her ne olursa olsun insanlar ister tabii fiziki dünyada yaşasın, isterse sanal ortamlarda bulunsun, bu ortamların kendisi insanları irade ve ihtiyar sahibi varlık olmaktan çıkarmamaktadır. Şu veya bu şekilde nihai kararı fertlere bırakmak kaçınılmaz olduğu için fertleri bu cihetten ortaya çıkan meydan okumalara yönelik olarak hazırlamak ve her bir ferdi sahip olduğu özellikleri de dikkat alarak muhtelif durumlarda durumların üstesinden gelecek yetkinliklere, yani melekelerle donatmak eğitimin temel amacı olarak kendisini göstermektedir. Bunun ön şartı ise insanların hayatında önemli ve en önemli ayrımı ve bunun üzerinden tercihlerde bulunmaları hususunda onları muktedir kılacak bir donanımın hazırlanmasıdır. Burada şunu ifade edeyim, işte önemli, daha önemli, daha önemli, daha önemli ve en önemli diye ayrım yaptığımızda önemsiz, daha az önemli, daha fazla önemsiz, daha da önemsiz ve en önemsiz, hatta o skalayı genişletebiliriz. Zararlı, biraz daha zararlı, çok zararlı ve en zararlı. Şimdi bu skalayı geniş tutmak zorundayız. Dolayısıyla bu manada çok değerli bir perspektiften artık çift değerli mantıkla, yani doğru yanlış, siyah beyaz gibi ayrımlarla yeni yetişen nesillerin yeni şartlara hazırlanması mümkün değil. O zaman burada çok değerli bir mantık ve değerlendirme düzeni oluşturarak bu çerçevede öğrencilerin veya yeni yetişen nesillerin kendileriyle alakalı karşılaştıkları sorunların üstesinden gelmesiyle alakalı becerilerinin, kabiliyetlerinin geliştirilmesi esas olmalı gibi gözüküyor.
Süremiz doldu bu arada. 20 dakikamız doldu.
Evet. Peki süreyle alakalı bir sorunumuz var ama zannediyorum 3 dakikada bitiririm. 3 dakika. Peki teşekkür ederim. Hem mühim ayrımı 3 ayrı perspektiften yapılabilir. Bunlardan birincisi varoluşsal, yani existential dediğimiz mertebe. Birincisi doğrudan fert açısından, yani existential açıdan diyeceğimiz, fert kendisi açısından önemli olan ile daha önemli ve en önemliyi tefrik edecek bir donanım kazanabilir. Bu cihet tamamen benlik ve kimlik sorularıyla alakalı olup, her bir ferdin kendisi, ebedi muhatabı ile ilişkisi içerisinde kendi kendisini keşfetmesiyle alakalı. Temel sorular, ben kimim, nereden geldim, neredeyim, nereye gidiyorum ve netice itibariyle nihai kararlarımı verirken hangi ilkelere dayanmalıyım sorularıdır ve bu soruların cevaplanması ferdin fert olarak varlığını kavraması ve anlamlandırmasının ön şartıdır. İkincisi toplum cihetinden karşımıza çıkar. Toplumun varlığı açısından önemli, daha önemli ve en önemli ki bu alanı kısaca değerler ve o duygusal olan taraflar, değerler duygusal ama aynı şekilde toplumsal kompetens dediğimiz, yani social competence olarak ifade ettiğimiz alan. Onun teferruatı üzerinde tabii durmayayım. Üçüncüsü ise doğrudan doğruya sistem ve mesleki hayat bir tür kariyer planlaması olarak düşünülmedir ki burası kabaca eğitimciler gayet iyi bilir zaten. O sistem integration dediğimiz alan ve o şeylerin, yeni yetişen nesillerin yani hem bir person olarak, şahsiyet olarak hem toplumun bir ferdi olarak ama aynı zamanda kendi gayelerini, ferdi amaçlarını gerçekleştirmek için gayret sarf eden bir varlık olarak yetiştirilmesi gerekiyor. Ama önemli olan nokta bunların birbirlerinden kopuk olarak değil, aynı ilkeden hareketle bunların bir bütünün parçası olarak planlanması kaçınılmaz. Bu demek oluyor ki öğrencilere gerektiği kadar malumat vermek yanında tercih ve tercih isabet becerilerini kazandırmak başarılı bir eğitim sisteminin ayrıcı hususiyet olacaktır. Bu hususta klasik eğitim tecrübesinde dil ve mantık eğitimi birikiminden istifade edebilir. Bunun teferruatını burada konuşmayayım ama şunu ifade edeyim. Dil esas itibariyle sınırlı kurallardan sınırsız cümle ve sınırsız ortamlarda, durumlarda o ortamlarda kendini ifade etmeyle alakalı kabiliyet, beceri kazandırır. Dilin öyle bir özelliği var. Bu Chomsky'den sonra bunu çok daha iyi biliyoruz. Ama söz konusu olduğunda özellikle mantık ve matematik alanı söz konusu olduğunda orada da içeriksiz bir şekilde formel düşünme becerileri gelişir. Dolayısıyla içeriksiz bir şekilde formel düşünmeyi biz mantık ve matematik eğitimleriyle destekleyebiliriz. Bu alanlar yani demek ki dil ve mantık matematik eğitimi aslında eğitimin merkezine yerleştirebilir ve bunların ikisi üzerinden sonra diğer alanlar geliştirilebilir. Bu hususta bir taraftan klasik eğitimde amaç olarak gözetilen ehil veya meleke sahibi insan yetiştirme ihya edilerek eğitim faaliyetinin merkezine yerleştirilebilir. Bunu yapmanın ön şartı da özgür yani faili muhtar olan ferdi yeniden keşfetmektir. Özgür olan ferdi keşfetmek insanı aşkın olan ile yani müteal olan, transcendent ile irtibatı içinde mükellef olarak kavramak. Ki buna o responsibility ile alakalı hep benden önceki konuşmacılar buna işaret etti. Bu nokta çok önemli. Genellikle insanlara hakları öğretilir de vazifeleri es geçilir. Haklar ve vazifeler birlikte eğitim sürecinin parçası olması kaçınılmaz. Bu mükellefiyetin en yakınına kendisini fiziki nesneleri, bitkileri, canlıları, insanları ve insanlar ile üretilmiş olan kurum ve kuruluşlar kadar bütün bunları yaratan ile varlığın yüklediği mükellefiyet cihetinden irtibat kurmayı iktiza etmektedir. Pandeminin öğrettiği şeylerden birisi insanların ancak birlikte ki bu aynı zamanda bütün insanlığın hep birlikte anlamına geliyor. Eylemlerinde belirli bir senkronizasyon üzerinden var olabileceklerini fark etmeleri olduğu gibi, belki bundan daha önemlisi, her bir insanın fert ve birey olarak bu sürece iştirak edeceğini, ferdin ve bireyin sahip olduğu yetkinliklerin bu süreçlerin üstesinden gelinmesinin ön şartı olduğudur. Pandeminin öğrettiği şeylerden birisi de hastalığın tedavisinden önce belki ondan daha önemli olanın sıhhatin muhafazası olduğu dikkate alınacak olursa, bunun eğitim açısından anlamı, insanı istihdam için hazırlamadan önce ona kendisini insan olarak muhafaza edecek ilgi ufkunun oluşturularak bilgiyi bu ilgi ufku içerisinde vermeye yönelmek olacaktır. Teşekkür ediyorum.
Evet, biz de çok teşekkür ediyoruz hocam. Çok sağ olun. Now I would like to turn again to panelists, but we have only 10 minutes to finish the panel, and so I can give only 2 minutes for each panelist.
Kullandığımı varsayıyorum.
Yes.
Ona. Evet.
I want to start with Enila.
Okay. I will make just a brief note and conclude on this brief note. Considering what was discussed today and what we discussed yesterday, I want to bring into focus the lessons learned and the silver linings that have come with the pandemic. And I think one very important one is the fact that we are resilient, that we can come or overcome adversity. I mentioned earlier that many people have suffered from poor mental health, but again, there are many, many others who have been resilient, who have engaged in positive coping mechanisms and have managed to overcome. And more importantly, I think that I know we have collective resilience, and in difficult times like the pandemic crisis, this is when we become aware once more of the collective resilience we have as a humanity, and that when we share and support and love each other, we can overcome difficulties and adversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Enrique?
I have 3 points that I would like to end with. The first one is that in times of crisis, when we are facing the lack of teachers, we sometimes try to find quick solutions. We've seen, for example, many places using teachers who are not licensed to be teachers, and they are brought in an emergency license, or thinking that it is enough to know the content area to be able to teach the content area, and that's when we bring people from other professions and we put them in classrooms to teach. And I think we know for a long time that it takes more than content knowledge to be able to teach. And it is important that rather than thinking about where can we find someone to put in a classroom, that we devote all of our efforts to actually strengthen the profession of being a teacher. And I agree with some of the ideas that Carlos was mentioning. The second point I want to make is about the importance of teaching mathematics that is meaningful and is relevant to students. I think that we need to break down some silos and reach out to other content areas, reach out to other ways of teaching so that mathematics can become more relevant and meaningful to all students. And finally, a point that was made earlier is it is important that those who are making decisions are the ones who are closer to the problem. And so empowering teachers and others close to the classroom to make decisions about the changes that need to take place is very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Carlos.
Thank you, Yusuf. So just two last ideas to share from what we have been conversing this morning. One of them, I think, has to do with the realization, again, that we need to rethink the purpose of education and the way we organize education systems, which is incoherent with what we want to achieve with education. So just to say, from what we've heard from some of the lessons that were left by the COVID pandemic, I think we overly emphasize the qualification function of education. So we know education serves the purpose of qualifying for the labor market, for the productive life, but I think we tend to forget that one of the most important functions of education is also socialization, something that Tahsin was mentioning as well. So the way that we actually build communities together, the way we live together in harmony, the way we thrive as a society, which has large implications, even evolutionary implications for the human race and for the human beings. So I think we should not undermine this idea of education also as a means for socialization, for subjectification, for how we form identities, preferences, ethical conducts, and so on. So I think it is very important that when we think about the losses and the gains, when we think about recovering or transforming, we need to strike a balance between adaptability and transformation. We are always, and it's good that we're resilient, I agree, but we're always trying to adapt to the changes in the labor market. We have to adapt to the changes that have brought up by the, climate change. We have to adapt to, there are many things that we might not want to adapt to, you see? I may not want to adapt to a society that conforms to certain discriminatory patterns. I may not want to adapt to an education system that discriminates. So instead of adapting, we need to transform as well. And I think we need to strike that balance between adaptability and transformation if we really want to see changes in our education systems. Thank you.
Thanks a lot again. We have listened to all participants, all panelists. I would like to thank to them again for their intellectually stimulating speeches. I have extracted some points from this panel. First, we must move to a more flexible and student-centered curriculum. We should educate students in future-oriented way, and by keeping in mind that future contains a lot of uncertainty and complexity, we should focus on social emotional skills and thinking skills. We need to increase teacher and student autonomy and empower teachers. We need to develop techno-pedagogical competences of teachers. We should provide more psychosocial supports for teachers and students. I personally benefit a lot from the conversations in this panel, and I followed them with pleasure. I hope you participants have a good time too. Thank you again for listening to us with patience and interest. I would also like to thank the Turkish Maarif Foundation for organizing this intellectually quality platform. Thanks a lot again. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank our esteemed speakers for this excellent panel, but we are not leaving you. I kindly invite the member of Executive Board, İpek Coşkun Armağan, to present the gifts to our esteemed speakers. we'll start with Professor Yusuf Alpaydın. Thank you so much for joining Istanbul Education Summit. Thank you. Now we'll present the gifts to our esteemed Professor Enila Cenko. Another gift goes to Professor Tahsin Görgün. Now we'll present the gifts to Professor Enrique Galindo. And the final gift goes to Carlos Vargas Tames. Thank you. I would like to thank all of our esteemed speakers and Andreas Schleicher who joined us online. It was a big pleasure to have you here in Istanbul Education Summit, and now we'll take a family picture. Thank you. I would like to thank all of our speakers. Before taking a break, we'll watch a video of one of our sponsors, Vakıfbank.